After wrapping up the first 2 weeks of this course, I believe there are at least two distinct methods to confront issues of diversity as an educator. One is to understand your own identity and biases in relation to the structure of society, and the other is to figure out how to teach students of all diverse identities to acquire the critical thinking skills to do the same for themselves. Prior to this class, I've had significant exposure to diversity both in my personal life and college education, which has helped me confront the forms of racism that I've experienced in my childhood, as well as the instances of discrimination I've witnessed happen to others around me. I have ample experience with political organizing and advocating for equal human rights for all, but I admit that I'm uncertain where to start with translating these perspectives in a professional and transparent manner in the classroom. When I was a paraprofessional a few years ago in a fourth grade classroom, I hosted a class on Zoom where we read a story about a powerful African American leader who organized boycotts during the civil rights movement. I agree with the goal of teaching that racism is systemic, but I found it difficult to pick the right words to convey this message when the lessons are designed to exemplify triumph and suggest that the country overcame racism in the civil rights movement. I had one student make a personal contribution that I'll never forget, which gave me the opportunity to stray from the limited norm. The student stated that his dad is black and he got pulled over by the police the prior week. Obviously, the student might not have all the information on the circumstances, but he said that his mom told him that it was because his father was black. The student also lives in a low income household and has disruptive behavior in class that often results in him being sent to the principal's office. Instead of trying to dismiss or redirect the conversation, I tried to validate the statement by confirming that racism still exists despite the efforts of the civil rights movement, and that it just looks a little different now, including the prevalence of police brutality and racial targeting in traffic stops. I was aware that one of the students in the same class was the son of a detective in the town's police force, and while flipping through the cameras, I saw the father of a black student sitting and listening into the lesson. I didn't get any parental feedback or reprimand from the classroom teacher for my comments, but I do wonder how I could have prepared to be more effective in answering that question and more questions like that in the future, and also turning it into a dialogue to get the opinions of other 10-year-olds in that class. Jamila Pitt's article, Don't Say Nothing, offers excellent suggestions for educators to facilitate discussions on race within their classrooms that dig deeper than these shallow celebrations of historically respected black figures. I agree that it's essential to draw out the history of racial oppression and inequality to understand the contemporary issues involving race today, no matter how many attempts there are to silence or discount an alternative narrative via national attacks and critical race theory. Students can't deny the injustices they see with their own eyes. To make sense of why the prison population is disproportionately black, why their neighborhoods are gentrified, and why they see people who look like them get killed for no reason, the prerequisite is to study how racism has functioned throughout history. I love that Pitts even suggests ways to incorporate material that addresses race in subjects that are technical and objective, like science. I appreciate the silent dialogue method of beginning the discussion, but this would be difficult to replicate in my classroom, where my students are either considered nonverbal or have difficulty functionally communicating. The week two material has helped me get the wheels turning in my brain to identify opportunities to teach about race and diversity in a special education setting. As for my personal experience, I attended elementary and secondary school in a district that wouldn't be considered racially segregated by the definition in DeMoss' article on the Mississippi School Order to Desegregate, but it definitely did serve a majority white student population by default of the town being predominantly white. I am half Puerto Rican on my father's side, but I was raised in a household with my white mother and older sister who I looked nothing like when I was growing up. These circumstances helped shape how I understood my identity at a young age. There were a few other Puerto Rican students I went to school with, but I felt inferior compared to them because I did not speak Spanish and I wasn't quote unquote loud and ghetto like them, as was explained by a few different white acquaintances. I acted white, and I was told on a couple different encounters from racist family members of my friends that I'm good and I'm not like the other Spanish people. My high school had a school resource officer that was often seen disciplining students for different reasons. I was called into her office on a few occasions. One included a reprimand for a necklace I wore that had a fake brass knuckles symbol on it because she said it was violent and threatening. I was called to speak with her another time where I was accused of saying I was going to fight someone that I never had any plans to. I also saw this officer come down harder and really villainize the actions of the few black students at my school. I can resonate with Pitt's sentiment in her article Don't Say Nothing that educators need to confront their feelings and biases about police and acknowledge that many black and brown students view police negatively. I hold the opinion, like many people in the city that I live in, Worcester, that police don't belong in schools or make them safer. The police are also universally taught in schools to be community helpers that keep us all safe, and this is promoted by field trips and activities with local police officers. This narrative is complexified when taking account of the recent instances of racism and police brutality that have triggered protests everywhere in the country. Black and brown students may reasonably not feel safe in this environment and fear that they will suffer the same fate of George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery in the future, and they are just trying to live their lives. As stated in Simmons' TEDx talk on imposter syndrome, there are many consequences to learning while black, like having to leave people you know and love behind and being targeted for the ebonics in your speech. When I think of the power that an educator has to teach something a student will remember for their whole life, it can either promote confidence or it can promote inferiority. For Simmons, she will never forget that embarrassing correction of how to pronounce asking, even after she has earned a doctorate and become a teacher herself. I never want to have that effect on a student, even if it may serve as some motivation to strive and succeed. As I'm not from the Bronx, I did face similar adversities as Simmons with how I grew up. I was raised by a single mother in a small apartment who became disabled and couldn't work by the time I was 12. I had a friend whose parents wouldn't drop them off at my house because the street I lived on had a reputation of being filled with drugs and fights. There was a lockdown at my middle school because there was a shooting on Granite Street, a street which I lived on from ages 0 to 19, and the gunman had eloped to the area of the school after. This level of violence is out of character for a small suburb, but I feel like other black and brown people still face more adversity in their neighborhoods on average compared to what I dealt with in my hometown. I defied my own expectations and decided to move to Boston for my undergraduate degree at 19, where I lived with multiple roommates crammed into one apartment. I was not concerned to be in close quarters with others because the new setting made me feel like I made it. I also found it an added benefit to be around people of different races and cultures. I had my initial experience of being seen as racially diverse in Boston compared to passing as white sometimes in my hometown. I felt like an imposter in two major ways. Coming from a poor family where no one else graduated high school and having to navigate college alongside students who come from both made me feel inferior, as if I escaped to a level in life where I didn't belong. As I befriended more black and brown people, I had to confront another layer of my identity that was suppressed by the dominant white culture that I grew up around. I feel like I am pushed into a gray area sometimes, where I'm neither black nor white, but I'm mixed. In the social evolution of a multiracial ethnicity and Asian American perspective, Mingles explains that mixed race people often belong to one or more groups, while at the same time not fully to one group, always existing on the border. Mingles also defines race as a grouping of dissimilar peoples by those in power to impose a social and economic hierarchical structure based on skin tone and country of origin. As a Marxist, I agree that race should be viewed in the lens of how it plays a necessary role in maintaining the system that dictates society, which is based on hierarchy and profit. Malcolm X said, "You can't have capitalism without racism," which suggests that if the barriers of race ceased to exist, and the general population was no longer divided by racial lines, the system would not be able to survive with the current white supremacy and hierarchy, because the majority would be united against those in power. Ingalls identifies main characterizations of race being based on skin tone and country of origin to be arbitrary and inaccurate, especially when it comes to the example of Asian Americans, who are a large collection of cultural and linguistic people with varying skin tones. Census data from 2016 revealed that Asians have the highest educational attainments of all races, but this differs widely across national and ethnic origins. I would suspect culture and the wealth disparity of Asians across different nations play a role in this phenomenon. For example, China has a reputation of very rigorous schooling for their kids, while some countries in South Asia have seen sharp declines in public satisfaction with their education upon multiple school closures. I also resonate with the sentiments of Carmen Zhu in her TEDx talk, where she says from an early age that she had to either decide to conform to the Asian stereotype or conform with the white norm of where she grew up. I had very little exposure to Asians in my community or schools that I attended, which often leads to believing stereotypes I see in the media. I found Zhu's sense of humor to be refreshing when addressing the clueless statements and questions she has heard from white people regarding her Asian identity. I received similar questions like, "Where is your family from?" and "What are you?" from people who can't pinpoint what my nationality is. Sometimes I say I'm half American from my Puerto Rican side and half European. He makes an excellent point that the successes of Asian Americans are often used as justification against other racial groups to prove that society is not racist, designated them as the model minority. Asian Americans may have not been items in the same slave trade like African Americans were, but they were oppressed by historically racist laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act, the anti Japanese sentiments after Pearl Harbor, and most recently in history, the increase in xenophobic attitudes towards Chinese people during the COVID-19 pandemic. I wish I had the time to individually comment on all of the insightful material I've consumed in the course thus far. To synthesize the perspectives on race that I've shared, it's a requirement for me as an educator to take account of the experiences of racism and discrimination I've encountered, as well as the millions of examples of systemic racism that still prevail. I will let them serve as evidence of why I can't afford to stay silent or sugarcoat the history of racism with my students. Though my students have disabilities that may impact how they view the world, it doesn't mean that they can't be conditioned by stimuli in their environment to use race as a lens to analyze the world around them. Race also undoubtedly affects the outcomes of children and adults with ASC, as a study from Wan, Lee, and Liu suggests that there might be racial and ethnic disparities in ASD prevalence. One thing I fear with my students of color is that they may exhibit maladaptive behavior in the view of a police officer and get in trouble. While teaching them the appropriate ways to act in public places in the presence of police, I can also afford them the knowledge of racial disparities in the justice system. I strive to ensure that my students don't become casualties to this unjust society we exist in, and to teach them the independence they need to effectively advocate for themselves and others in their communities.